America runs the world today, and almost every single metric the Americans lead in technology, media, military, economy, and more. However, lots of people, including Americans, don't understand how America really works or what actually founded it, viewing it as a series of pop culture tropes rather than a real society. In fact, Americans are some of the most culturally illiterate people about their own society I've seen in any culture in the world, since they don't deal with enough other cultures to be able to see what the defining features of their culture are. This is a video to see what America is about, what separates it from other societies, how it started, and where it's going. Watch this video to understand the world's great power today. Hearing about government databases getting hacked is embarrassing, and seeing what should be the most secure servers get hacked really makes you worry about your own security. But there's a way to avoid getting hacked with PIA VPN, a virtual private network that hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through an encrypted tunnel that keeps your browser data from your internet service providers, cyber criminals, and government censors, ensuring your information is safe from any prying eyes. Using the internet without PIA is like holding your wallet in your back pocket. Recently, PIA VPN released a new feature working on an unlimited number of devices, which is a game changer for VPNs. PIA VPN is the most transparent VPN on the market, and they never store or record your data, meaning what you do online is just between yourself and the screen. PIA goes above and beyond to protect your information like no one else, and lets you access content from anywhere in the world. For my fans only, they are offering to let you use PIA VPN for slightly over $2 a month, plus an additional 4 months for free. That's 83% off for anyone who uses the link in the description. So don't wait, get PIA VPN and protect your information for the safest possible browsing experience. This video's got a similar structure to the other civilization videos I've made so far, like Western or Islamic civilization. Although America is very clearly part of Western civilization, I've made the argument in this video that America will evolve into becoming its own civilization over the next couple hundred or thousand years. In most social science studies, America, in fact, is the area that takes the West's cultural traits to the furthest extreme, being the most Western society in the world. Yet, as Aristotle said, when you push something to its logical conclusion, it becomes something completely different, and I believe this will occur in America over the next 1,000 years. However, as you'll see, I think this is a useful prism through which to view America, even if America is very clearly part of Western civilization. America is strange in that its existence as a country is much more predicated upon events that happened in a completely different continent than the actual history of the location it's in. What I mean by that is that the native peoples were often quite advanced, with Cahokia in Illinois, for example, having a population larger than London's in the year 1200. However, that entire civilizational and cultural trajectory has very little bearing upon the current US, which is fundamentally an extension of European civilization. Actually, genetically native people are less than 1 or 0.5% of America's population. One of my favorite historians, Leland DeWitt Baldwin, said America is a side effect of the English Civil War, and that's a good place to start to try to figure out America's identity. The starting point is that, like every other country in the world, America's sense of its history is warped by what it wants to believe, and one of the biggest myths we get is that America is a single nation, rather than an ethnic federation that is over time fused into a single identity. One of the best books you ought to read in order to understand America is Albion Seed by David Hackett Fisher. It goes through how America's identity is driven off 4 regional migrations from Britain during the colonial period. These separate cultural groups exist until today, and drive the country's politics, culture, and every action it does. You can track these regions with linguistics, architecture, voting patterns, and anything else you would want to look for. We've validated this on a genetic basis where all of these groups still exist today, comprising the genetics of around 60% of Americans, with these ethnic groups being larger than most European countries. The ethnic differences between the northern and southern British Americans are equal to that between different European countries, and is large enough that you would have expected a large mountain range or desert on the Mason-Dixon line. I go through all of these separate groups in my first video on American regional cultures in greater depth. The northern United States was settled by 3 distinct groups. The first are the New England Yankees, who formed what amounted to an ethno-state. They were religious fanatics from eastern England. They were almost entirely middle class and created a culture with extreme amounts of control over people's lives, legally banning Christmas, dancing, music, being lazy, or arguing too loudly with your spouse. Their church services were 6 hours long, where a giant painted eye of God would stare down the congregation. At the same time, they were competing to be the wealthiest society in the world, as well as easily being the most technologically innovative per capita, equal, and educated in the whole world. The Yankees averaged 10 children every generation, almost all of whom survived, and then had another 10 kids, making this region a giant population steamroller. The Yankees populated the whole northern tier of America, stretching out to Michigan, Utah, and the Northwest. The Yankee world is known for being extremely competent, obsessed with social reforming, and also hated by the rest of the country for being condescending, rude, and arrogant. Then you get New York, which was founded by the Dutch and later conquered by the British. Ever since, it's been a city-state that exists to be the culturally diverse seaport that sucks up cultural creativity from abroad and then funnels it to the rest of America. New York is a black hole that's able to be so creative and industrious by basically only caring about money. Then the final part of the North is the Midland Quakers in Pennsylvania, where I grew up. It really pisses me off when people call me a Yankee, since Pennsylvania is extremely culturally distinct from the rest of the Northeast, and in some ways is culturally closer to the Midwest. The Quakers were religious fanatics from North England, like the Puritans, but believed in the exact opposite stuff. They're a meditation-based religion with no hierarchy who believe in tolerance and free thinking. They set up Pennsylvania as an anarcho-capitalist state with lots of immigrants, especially from Scotland and Germany. Pennsylvania was the wealthiest, most populous, and cosmopolitan state in early America, being a big driver of the Industrial Revolution. It formed the Midwest culture of being friendly, down-to-earth, hard-working, and created the idea of religious and social tolerance in America. This is the origin of Middle America. Pennsylvania is called the Keystone State since the Middle States played the moderating role for all of American history between the South and the North, who were permanent enemies, holding the country together. The problem with this cultural system is that it's too provincial, inward-looking, and laid back. New York was always able to outcompete Philadelphia, given Philadelphia cared much more about maintaining its local social structure than being on top of the next innovation, making Philly more pleasant than New York, but also turning it into a backwater. Now we cross the Mason-Dixon line into the South. You know, I actually used to live right on the Mason-Dixon line, which is the border between the northern and southern states, with my school bus stop in Delaware and my house in Pennsylvania. However, until recently, this was a massive jump between an almost entirely white, urban, merchant society in the temperate zone to a mixed-race, agrarian, aristocratic one in the tropical, with alligators and palm trees. Virginia was settled by the second sons of South English nobility that made an aristocratic society that provided much of early America's best leadership, like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, or Robert E. Lee. Virginia was settled by a combination of these aristocrats and poorly educated small farmers. The land was divided up between massive plantations, and the South became a society with a very clear class structure and the worst human development statistics in all of America for all of America's history. In order to maintain their standard of living as aristocrats, they needed workers, but the whites were unwilling to be their serfs, thus meaning they started importing black slaves, who became 1/3 of the South's population. The compromise between upper and lower class whites was to basically oppress blacks, and that resulted in white supremacy being an incredibly integral force of Southern culture, which only really started to loosen up in the 60s. Black Americans became a racial caste that were kept as slaves, didn't breed with whites, and were prevented from owning property, obtaining an education, rising to leadership, or operating in the market for the first 250 years. Due to being isolated from the white society as slaves for their first 250 years, blacks have remained a separate caste in American society for their entire history. Blacks today are significantly poorer, often living in heartbreaking ghettos, and commit crimes at much higher rates. The United States has paid for the sins of slavery by having the black community's social problems for centuries afterwards. This Virginian culture morphed into the Deep South, further south, an area that was 2/3 black in the colonial and early Republic period. The Deep South lost Virginia's aristocratic character, being a nouveau riche ruling class that only cared about money, and became much more brutal due to having to keep down the majority black population. It's been the South's deeply conservative, fiery core that's also been the nemesis with New England, while the Middle States decide whoever wins in the culture war. At the same time, the Deep South has provided America with much of its culture, whether rock, barbecue, or jazz. David Hackett Fisher's book African Founders is a pretty good black version of Albion Seed, showing their influence on American society. The final area of the South and cultural region of America is Appalachia. This area was settled by Scots-Irish tribes of Northern Ireland in the English-Scottish borderland. They were used to centuries of war and didn't have a strong work ethic, organizational abilities, or unified society. This makes the Scots-Irish area some of the very poorest in all of America. However, their warrior culture has kept America real, vital, and from descending into decadence and elitism. Our country would be much more beta and cringe without them. You can thank the Scots-Irish for America's charismatic religion, pushing the frontier forward against the Indians, country music, cowboy culture, and everything else that's badass. The Scots-Irish populated a massive region stretching from the Appalachian Mountains to Texas, New Mexico, and Oregon. These 6 American regional cultures formed all of America's cultures before the American Civil War. The nation was formed as a federation between them in which the national politics were compromises and negotiations made by each region. We don't talk about this at all since it would push against the American attempt at unification that our society has been pushing. People like to say immigration has destroyed these groups. However, first of all, immigration is overhyped, with roughly half of America's ancestry in 2010 coming from before the Revolution. And from genetics, a majority of non-Hispanic white ancestry is of British and Irish origin even today. However, the immigrants assimilated into these previous regional cultures, thus allowing them to survive until today, and much of American politics is still about maintaining compromises and negotiations between them. Hi everybody, I'm Rudyard the Woodafaltist guy, and I'm really excited to shout out my new podcast called Common Ground. I'm going to be doing it with David Hamilton from the America's Future Foundation, and we're going to be bringing on interesting guests and trying to talk about subjects in a way that promotes anti-partisanship and America also becoming a more noble, generous, honorable, and intelligent country to go through difficult topics through nuance and intelligence. And I think you all are really going to like it, and I'm very excited, and our first episode's going to be coming out in the next week. Even though there is a great degree of regional diversity, America is culturally unified to a pretty good degree and shares many similar values, those making up the American character as a nation. As alluded to before, America is culturally the most Western nation in the world. In cultural psychology, there's a term called weird, or Western educated, industrial, religious, and democratic. Weird societies are a cultural aberration in comparison to the rest of the world. They're individualist, rational, view time and causation as linear, analyze variables in isolation rather than holistically, and view morality as an abstract rather than a social norm. The US on most cultural surveys scores the most extremely weird society in the world, while Japan or Indonesia are on the other extreme side of the scale. This makes sense given England was already one of the most weird societies in the world, and what ends up happening is that in colonies, the most extreme elements of the previous culture at that time get amplified and fossilized. America was settled largely by Britain's middle classes, the most weird social class, thus pushing it even further. America's biggest advantage as a society is its English cultural heritage, where if you look at countries in the Anglosphere, and you could throw the Netherlands in this, the Netherlands, England, Canada, the US, Australia have extremely different geographies, but they're all wealthy, successful societies, thus meaning the cultural institutions were able to provide those societies with lots of advantages. And lots of people like Peter Zeihan or Real Life Lore like to say that America is successful purely due to its geography, and that's partially true because America does have a good geography in many regards. However, America did not have a perfect geography. You look at a lot of the South was malarial and swampland, including the entire state of Florida until recently. The West was a desert. The Great Plains weren't farmable, but the U.S., due to having an advanced cultural technologies, was able to make those lands habitable for white Americans. And you look at Argentina as another example. Argentina has a perfect geography. It's temperate, has some of the most fertile soil in the world, a central river system, but because it had an Iberian cultural heritage, it wasn't able to become a successful society. And Amaury Duriancourt said America is an old society in a new nation, and that the cultural trajectories America pulled from are thousands of years old, while America itself is only a couple hundred years old. There are 3 countries that I think are useful to compare to America over this video, those being the English, Romans, and Chinese. Let's start with the English. America is culturally a hyper-powered England. England in 1600 was known for being an individualistic, capitalist, free-thinking, and intrepid country inside the European context. Then America took all of those traits even further. In most ways, it's useful to view America by looking at English trends and then putting them on the scale of a continent. More so, the American character is heavily based off the England of that very era. 17th century England was religiously fanatical, so freedom-loving it killed the king, practiced laissez-faire capitalism, was very well armed, had lots of religious tolerance, and was starting the scientific revolution. Those are all things America kept for its whole identity, while they were just a phase for Britain. You can even see this in how American English is an archaic form of early modern English. The English that Shakespeare spoke is closest to that spoken in the current US. David Hackett Fischer has written an interesting book called Fairness and Freedom, showing how the US acts more like 17th century England that it came from, while for New Zealand it acts more like the 19th century Britain that settled it. This leads to another interesting point where the US has a fossilized social structure from the medieval/early modern Europe that created it. Let me repeat that. The US has the social and political structure of a medieval country. Before you Europeans start snickering, that doesn't bode well for you guys. An interesting point I read is that the US was founded by rural people who kept an older European social norm, while the culture in the cities was that which won out in Europe. Thus, the US maintained an older, more antiquated order. Some of the examples of this is that the US Constitution is closest to the federalized, decentralized states of medieval Europe like the Holy Roman Empire, rather than a modern European country. Modern European countries had strong centralized governments run by unified elites. The US, meanwhile, maintained the earlier model of less strong class divisions, but strong regional ones. In the US, like medieval Europe, no one strong social class was able to solidify control over the society, with instead power being batted back and forth between different social groups. The US, like medieval Europe, is a so-called veto-ocracy, in which there are many social groups that are capable of vetoing a decision, rather than a single class like in Europe. This has made the US a less hierarchical society than Europe. This is also the US's greatest advantage over any other country, its divided elite. In most societies, a single elite, whether the bureaucrats in China and France, or the priests in ancient Egypt and India, hijack the society for their own gain, thus effectively strangling the whole society's progress. However, the US, due to its decentralization, is always able to transfer elites when the old ones become corrupt. However, there is a significant disadvantage to this in that the US, since it has so many social classes that have power, it's very difficult to pass decisions since one group can just veto it, which is why Congress has not done anything in 40 years. You can see this change of elites, with the first being the coastal merchant elite, who were replaced by the southern plantation owners, who in turn were replaced by the northern industrialists, and then they were in turn replaced by coastal technocrats. And now the new order that's forming is probably an internet-based elite that's going to coalesce around the Gulf. If you look at a European country as an example, in Britain, the elite for centuries were the public school aristocrats, and when they fell, so did the empire. In France, they've been run for the last 300 years by Parisian technocrats. Also, like a medieval country, the US has maintained its right to rule through divine right rather than the Westphalian nation-state. After the 30 Years' War, European countries started to build their identities around being a distinct ethnic nation, like France, Germany, or Britain. However, the US kept the older system of believing itself to be a God-chosen nation with its right to rule coming from divine providence. The US has remained the most religious country in the developed world, given, like a medieval country, there's been a separation of church and state. America has competition between different churches, thus creating a selection pressure towards churches that are able to keep their audiences interested, thus making American Protestantism the most dynamic branch of Christianity around the world, which America has exported to Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Another big factor in America's continued religiosity is probably that it was founded by religious fanatics. For the countries of Western Europe, they were founded as fundamentally Catholic societies, and even the ones that became Protestant kept this Catholicism from their childhood. And a great example of this is how the European Union is a new Catholic Church in all reality. However, America has always been a Protestant society, and because of that, even for non-Protestant, Catholic, or agnostic Americans, they maintain Protestant assumptions of the world, like that you derive your own meaning by building your own relationship with God, or that rituals and ceremonies are empty, or that we all have to find our own happiness in life and carve our own path. Americans view their country as the greatest in the world, and their founding documents like the Constitution or Declaration of Independence say this directly in their language. America is seen as a divine religious project to spread freedom around the world. America's foreign policy is more guided by this messianic mission than any real practicality. I've seen the argument that American patriotism is a religion, with the Constitution being a sacred document, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. This leads us to the next two comparisons, those of Rome and China. I'm not going to go into as much detail comparing Rome to America because I've already made a 40-minute video about it. However, the two countries' histories parallel each other in an incredibly eerie way. With both being ethnic amalgam superpower republics who viewed themselves as God-chosen with their entire legal code and freedoms, they formed federations and quickly rose to domination of the developed world through two disastrous wars. They then felt decadence, social problems, moral decay, and massive inequality as the republics became extremely stressed. The Romans and Americans share the same can-do spirit, with the same unstoppable amount of energy and dynamism, with a sense of civic nationalism that allowed them to assimilate very culturally distinct peoples due to their divine religious projects. I mean, the founders of the American Republic literally modeled themselves off the Romans. They both started as extremely socially conservative, stoic, Puritan religious, and then as they became very wealthy, very fast, became a materialistic, consumption-based society. I'm going to get back to the negative sides of this comparison later on in the video. Finally, China. The US and China are the only two countries that have been able to occupy and colonize their entire temperate zones, with both countries occupying the same latitudes, with Beijing sitting at Philadelphia, Harbin at Maine, and Hong Kong at the Florida Keys. Both have been largely self-sufficient for their whole histories, not really needing resources or outside input, while being completely geographically isolated from any real threats. The US is culturally closest to Britain, spiritually to Rome, and geostrategically to China. The worry that comes from sharing this geostrategic position with China is that China, due to its security, became indolent and silly. When the British arrived in 1791 with steamships, rifles, and advanced clockwork, technology literally 500 years more advanced than anything in China, the Chinese called the British barbarians and refused to trade with them. America has the same kind of arrogance. Americans have absolutely no curiosity about other cultures and do not pay attention to international politics. The world ends at New York and Los Angeles as far as many Americans are concerned. As I said before, American foreign policy is bombing a foreign country and then forgetting they exist. During World War II, Roosevelt's foreign policy in Eastern Europe had more to do with Polish-American voters than the actual Eastern European situation. America's foreign policy is extremely irrational and emotional, driven off the whims of suburban moms. This extends to America's general arrogance and foolishness. America has never really had hardship, military occupation, famine, tyranny, or mass poverty. America is one of the very, very few countries where people have never had to worry about famine or even hunger on a real scale. American black slaves were better fed and housed than the peasantries of a third of Europe. This means that the US pushes retarded social planning, and this sets the US up in the future for retarded social engineering, with social justice being the current example. American utopianism has negatives, with a great example being the tech sphere, where Silicon Valley dropped their massive technologies in the whole world, and they literally said, all change is good, let's change the world, and nothing bad can happen, and now we're all lonely and depressed. The utopian spirit stems from the frontier, in which America has had so much open space that it can just afford to be extremely wasteful. Frederick Jackson Turner has made the popular argument that American culture is fundamentally based off the frontier, and I think that's true to a certain degree. The frontier meant that so many people had their wildest dreams fulfilled, meaning America is a very optimistic, innovative, and entrepreneurial society. This also leads to America being a very charitable society, being the country that gives by far the most to charity of anywhere in the world. You can also see this in the US doing the Marshall Plan, treating its empire like Japan or Germany very well, or forgiving the South after the Civil War. The frontier has given America a sense of openness and looseness that's still around today. In almost every American state, once you leave the big cities, it's infinite, open, wild spaces. I hiked across the states of Massachusetts and Connecticut, which are both really urban by American standards, and in both, I would go for 4 days straight climbing on top of mountains where you could see miles in each direction, and you wouldn't see a single farm or house in the distance for days straight, only endless forest. Your average American state is larger than the average European country. If you fail in one part of America, there's this idea that you can just move to a completely different part of the country and have a complete restart. There's been this debate over the course of American history about whether the American character stems from its British cultural origins, the frontier, diversity, or oppression. I agree mostly with the first, since if you compare America to other Anglo countries like Australia or the UK, which only share the British cultural heritage, the similarities are extremely close. The frontier as well, as I've posited, I think does a lot of the rest. It gives the Americans their big sky view of the world. It also allows diversity. The reason Americans are happy with so much diversity and immigration is that their country is so big that you can imagine the people who are different from you are living somewhere else away from you, and that there is enough to go around for everyone. Europeans struggle with their immigration more since their countries are already tight and overpopulated, creating a feeling of scarcity and having the immigrants be forced to jostle for a shared culture rather than building their own and integrating at their own speed. The idea that America's cultural identity is fundamentally based off diversity doesn't make sense, considering New England was an ethno-state where everyone was exactly the same cultural type for its first 200 years, and the South never had wide-scale immigration. As a right-winger, I'm going to genuinely investigate the claim that America is built off oppression. There is a kernel of truth to it. America conquered this land from the natives, many of whose treaties it broke and savaged them. It also brutally oppressed the blacks for centuries in a really unforgiving way. However, if you compare America to a country actually built off oppression like Russia or South Africa, it's a very different picture. In Russia until 1860, 80% of their population were kept as serfs who had no legal rights, could be drafted to serve their whole life in the army, and were regularly whipped and raped by their landowners. Even the nobility referred to themselves as slaves to the absolutist monarch. Likewise, in South Africa, the majority black population was given zero legal rights, forced to live in different cities, commuting hours to work for the whites. They were also only allowed to own land on overcrowded reservations and isolated from their families and work nude in deadly mines. This only stopped in the 1990s. From this perspective, calling America a country inherently built off oppression is just laughable. However, once the frontier was removed, America started to have serious social problems. Americans are by nature a very greedy people, not even seeing a problem with this. In the time since the frontier is closed, Americans have operated off assumptions as if it was still there, thus resulting in serious social issues. Americans will automate offshore industries to other countries and import massive amounts of immigrants because they're still thinking it's the 19th century when America has a giant frontier that it needs to expand at all costs. Or what they did instead was kill the American middle class by crushing wages. The American baby boomer generation has been overtly greedy, turning the whole society for a binge for them, eroding social institutions for their descendants. The big flaw of this view is radical social individualism. Let's take California, where I am now. No one trusts each other, there's no community, shared values, and everything looks like an infinite parking lot. When you push the American individualistic logic, you don't get a society, you get a lot of angry, dumb, and sad individuals. In California, most of the time you assume people are completely self-serving and greedy. Early Americans were able to have their freedoms as they were responsible, supported their communities, and had strong values. Without those, people become single mothers dependent on the state and pushing radical ideologies to fill the void in their souls, while their entire cultural life is bought and pre-designed for them by corporations, and their only friends being those who think they're cool enough to hang out with them, while rejecting their parents since they don't get them or support their drive for greed. At its foundation, the US government was an arbitration system between the different regional cultures mentioned before. However, over time it became a massive force in its own right. At the same time, you saw the creation of a pan-American culture, which transcended into becoming a massive empire in its own right. This obviously started with the American Civil War, in which it became clear that the centralized government was superior to states' rights, and the centralized government fielded an army numbering in the millions. However, the colonization of the western states required a much stronger federal government. Up to the 100th parallel, or into the Great Plains, the climate and geography is exactly the same as the East Coast, thus allowing the eastern cultures to just keep going west. However, the deserts and mountains of the West required mass cooperation, provided by the state, with the continent spanning railroads being the best example. In my second video on American regional cultures, I talk about the West. You saw the development of the Great Plains into a giant, heavily Germanic, wholesome but boring breadbasket, In the bone-dry West, you saw cowboys, religious fanatics, and weirdos congregate around water supplies. The West Coast was populated, meanwhile, by dreamers and the people with the most utopian frontier character we talked about before. The West Coast has become incredibly delusional, while also being the cultural and technological cutting edge. Los Angeles is a culturally isolated city-state like New York on the other side of the continent, but instead focused on entertainment and known for being fake and delusional. Over the 20th century, due to easier transport and the air conditioner, we saw the center of America's population move away from the Rust Belt states to the South and the West, with the U.S.'s population distribution becoming largely even now. The coastal West became socially progressive while the interior conservative. With the railroads, you saw the creation of a pan-American culture. It's interesting to talk to West Coast people and see how their cultural forms are so different from the Pennsylvania where I grew up. In Pennsylvania, everyone has an insane amount of regional pride. Each county where I grew up had a different reputation and stereotype. However, west of the plains, in most cases if you ask what the culture of that area stands for, or what they're proud of, people shrug. The idea of carrying a county identification is ridiculous in most of the West. Pennsylvania still has a largely Christian shared cultural consensus, and there's a sense of broader community, while in the West, everyone's a transient with no values or sense of cooperation. The American West is a culture that's completely new in the modern world, with a couple exceptions like Dubai, in that it's mostly artificial. I mean, for most of the West, they have nowhere near enough water, which has to be shipped in hundreds of miles. There are no shared values, walkable towns, or shared community spaces, no cultural traditions or sense of history. Societies like this have never existed before in history, since those things, which bind culture and community together, are all necessary to support a society through hard times like wars. The West Coast pushed America's logic of utopianism and money to the point where nothing else existed, thus creating extremely weak cultural foundations, which are now promulgating that region's rapid decline today. The idea of an American anti-culture is so important, and this is the culture that is spread around the world to become a norm today. I remember when I was driving in Phuket in the Indian Ocean in Thailand, thinking this looks exactly like Florida. This culture believes in nothing, has no tradition, and no stories except what Hollywood wants to sell you today. There's a book called The Geography of Nowhere, talking about how since World War II, America has killed any cultural diversity, with the geography of strip malls, Walmarts, and McMansions showing this. Since America was created by people of largely middle and lower class background, they've always distrusted intellectuals because they were back in Europe, tools of the upper class to justify their power. However, in America, this has evolved, and especially more so since the 60s, into a culture that hates any kind of wisdom or thinking about abstracts, which means Americans cannot think about concepts or what the meaning of actions are. Since Americans are incapable of thinking about abstract concepts, they're incapable of thinking about the future in a real way because they have no understanding of the past, and they're incapable of making real trade-off decisions. Americans can't think about the bigger picture of what the effects of their actions are, and so they do stuff like invade a Middle Eastern country, then get bored, pull out, and then radical Islamists take power. And a lot of the American philosophy that's developed since the 60s of, man, we should just smoke weed and chill and you can't judge anyone, makes literally no sense if you want to run a society for a long period stably because you have to make real trade-offs. But in America, we just don't think about how the actions we make now will continue in the future. America has socialized all of its immigrants and various regional differences with public schools that push conformity, inoffensiveness, compliance, and lack of curiosity. People's childhood experiences are extremely formative, and this is becoming America's society today, where we all live in a society that's high school, where we work hard in uniform corporations to buy a McMansion. I've met a lot of the most successful young Americans, and it was really depressing to realize they only cared about money and sex, having no knowledge of history, religion, philosophy, or real interest in the travel or the world. It blows my mind people cannot know or care about their own heritage. This is the quiet, boring road to despotism. David Reisman has a book called The Lonely Crowd, which is about how our society is anxiety-based, or we're all trying to compete for social status and approval, meaning no one is being authentic or doing what they really want. The movie American Beauty shows this incredibly well, a society where no one is fulfilled or anything means anything. Suffering builds character, and America has had things so easy it has nothing to care about. Interestingly, European visitors in the 20th century have said America was a very feminized society, while those in the 18th and 19th centuries said America was a very patriarchal one. And this makes sense in a lot of ways, because during the frontier period, it was lots of struggle against nature and large threats that would make the society more manly. Meanwhile, later American society is very commercialized, and women control 85% of spending because they are more likely to make decisions for the whole household in large purchases like cars or houses, and they care more about details. Although women are wonderful, in the same way there's toxic masculinity, there is very clearly toxic femininity. And some examples of it include inability to deal with real external threats, lack of interest in hard intellectual or academic subjects, and instead focusing on what amounts to gossiping, extremely high rates of anxiety and emotionality in the society, lack of clear moral standards with empathizing over systematizing, a real obsession with consumption and having social status through that rather than extolling people like generals or intellectual leaders or politicians. This also includes using shaming as a means to control society. People talk a lot about toxic masculinity, and I'm not going to say that everything is perfect for women. I think women actually have it pretty rough today. However, if you look across the historic record, we are the society that is the least toxic masculine of any ever. The normal historical society is one where women get married off at age 15, and there are honor killings. And, I mean, if we're being really honest, if you had a toxically feminine society, you would expect it to constantly be shaming itself for being toxically masculine. Interestingly enough, the exact same process occurred in Rome, moving from a very patriarchal to a very feminized society on the exact same timescale as modern America during the late Republican period. Ever since the time of Hamilton and Andrew Jackson, America has always been divided between the coasts that have wanted to ape Europe and the interior that wants America to be its own culture. When you boil it down, this is the cultural divide today, between the coasts which want to turn America into a socialist, irreligious, demilitarized continent like Europe, and the interior that wants American culture to stick to its 19th century liberal roots. The left and right split is fundamentally the conflict in the cultural vision of America, which the West Coast has achieved, of a society of atomized individuals, freed from history, the restraints of culture and religion, to achieve what they want, while the right views this as a meaningless hell. The federal government and the college-educated technocrats were built in order to provide balance between America's regional cultures. However, over time, they became a force that wanted to destroy them. Social justice literally says white Americans don't have a culture, which is what I'm sure they want to believe, since that culture is the biggest thing that prevents them from seizing total power, in the same way elites have in most empires in history. When you look at cities like Washington, D.C. or Florida, they are places without really a culture or identity. The left pushes for immigrants as they don't belong to any traditional American cultures and can thus be co-opted more easily for their scheme. In the same way that ancient Greek philosophy percolated the Roman Republic after it conquered Greece, the left wants to turn America from a medieval European country to a modern European country. The worrying thing here is that Europe has seen collapsing economic importance against the U.S. since World War II. It's militarily incapable of protecting itself. Its percentage of inventions and cultural advancements has collapsed too. America's greatest advantage has been its ability to shift out cultural elites. However, the American system has no protections against bureaucracy and technocracy because it never plans to have a bureaucracy in the first place. And we've seen those institutions or managers, whether in large corporations or in the government, take over more and more of America's society. And all the checks and balances we've built have had no protections against them, so they can just keep expanding. And I worry that a leftist social engineering technocracy will seize control of our society and then take it in a direction like the bureaucrats in China, the priests in India, or the slave owners in ancient Rome, co-opting all of society and destroying its vigor. The record for immigration in America has largely not been this scheme of turning into a permanent wedge against society. Immigrants have assimilated very rapidly in America, normally adding one big element to the larger culture, such as food with the Italians, a rebellious spirit with the Irish, food and industriousness with Germans, comedy for the Jews, and more. An example of how far this has gone is that social justice treats white people as a single group, who are privileged, ignoring how many white Americans, grandparents, mine included, grew up in ethnic ghettos and their parents viewed themselves as a minority. My father would tell me, "I'm the last of the Irish and you're just an American." From everything we've seen so far, the recent waves of Hispanic and Asian immigrants have followed the same trajectory, with 60% of Asians marrying the rest of the American community every generation and 40% of Hispanics do. And these groups are incredibly hardworking, don't commit crimes, and are happy to be Americans. In my earlier video, I talk about why the Romans have so many incredible similarities with the Americans. I worry that America will follow a similar trajectory to what Rome did, by trashing everything that made them special in the first place in order to become the world's hegemon. As I've said before in previous videos, I'm not worried at all about the US as a player on the world stage, being replaced by India or China. Those countries have incredibly serious problems we don't hear about. The US remains technologically, economically, socially, militarily, and culturally dominant today, while it is entirely self-sufficient for resources, has the most stable demographics of any country in the developed world, and is also the most religious, which carries a lot of benefits. America could very easily rule the world for the next 500 years. However, America and Rome are similar in that they are incredibly adaptable, intrepid, and brave. In that process, they traded out everything that made their nations, becoming completely indistinguishable from how they started since they were so obsessed with growth. Nations are held together by common blood, shared goals, shared enemies, and shared political systems. Rome became a giant multi-ethnic empire, lost its religion, defeated all its enemies, and became an authoritarian socialist state. In the US, people of British and Irish ancestry are now 1/3 of the genome, down from their majority in the 60s. 1/3 of Americans are non-religious, we've defeated the Indians, Nazis, or Soviets, and we are becoming less and less of a functioning democracy every day. In both Rome and America, you saw the loss of traditional values. In my childhood, people talked about freedom, hard work, patriotism, and decency, and now I only hear whining by wokes who seem to be literally, purposely committing cultural suicide. This was then followed in both Rome and America by the rise of mass commercialism, the crushing of regional identities, and a huge rise into sheer materialism and greed. In both Rome and America, there was a huge effort to crush the wages of the average workers, whether through importing Syrian or Gallic slaves, or alternatively, large amounts of Mexican immigrants or offshoring to Malaysia and China. This created a large urban proletariat dependent upon welfare payments, while there used to be a large middle class, and this resulted in the breakdown of the political system as the democracy spiraled out of control. Democracy is a very expensive social technology that can only come from a responsible, well-educated, property-owning populace. When you remove these, you get demagogues like Latin America. Every anxiety-based society before in history, whether Republican Rome, ancient Greece, Sung China, and the courts of Tsarist Russia, Spanish America, and l'Ancien Regime France, fell to Caesarism. Once the lonely crowd jostles among itself, it looks for a Caesar to lead it. I worry that American utopian thinking, combined with how delusional the country can be, will enforce centuries of bizarre social engineering on the rest of the world. I mean, just look at how the Romans used slavery and gladiators and spread them around the world against that world's consent, and I hope America won't do the same. As Americans, we have some of the greatest forefathers of anyone, men like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Henry Ford, or Martin Luther King, who in thousands of years will still have statues built to them. Let's not let our country, heritage, and civilization down. As a YouTuber who knows nothing about you, I give you the only things I can: pride and dignity.